and we'll get started. All right, so welcome everybody to the latest in the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics seminar series. Today's speaker will be Kate Kish from the University of Breton, and we'll get to her in a second. I just want to remind everybody that our next seminar will be July 26th. It's a Friday at noon, and the speaker will be Alejandro Afagano from France. He's on, actually just logged on. Uh, so, um, we will get going in a second here. Let me properly introduce Kate. Kate Kish is an assistant professor at the Cape Breton University Shannon School of Business. She's in the MBA Community Economic Development Program, and she is the president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. One of the prime reasons that we asked her to speak today. And as a society, we think it's important for us to interact with our other regional society partners. And Kate was gracious enough to speak today. So I will pass it off to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think this is a great idea, great initiative. Something that CanC we've talked about several times about trying to bring people together like this, and just never got around to it, volunteer capacity. But so I think this is really great, and I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, hi, I'm Katie or Kate, depending, when you've met me in my life. Yeah, I'm the president of CanC. I've been the president for a couple of years. I've been on the board since 2013. And yeah, now I'm out in Cape Breton, which is in Nova Scotia, Canada, basically almost as far east as you can get in Canada, very close to the ocean. It is quite a beautiful place. So I'm going to speak to you all today about some of the research that I've been working on over the last about 5 years or so, maybe 4 or 5 years, on different approaches with data and bridging data gaps for mainly communities and rural communities. So I won't start out with why I look at well-being, because this group is really aware. I think about why we need to shift away from GDP, because it's important that we account for things like quality of life and other non-economic measurements of success in life. And that's especially true in rural areas where economic outputs really don't capture the health of a community at all. So the idea is that by bringing these well-being indicators to rural communities and community groups, that policymakers can develop, this more holistic understanding of rural spaces and of how to create targeted policies that can be designed to improve the quality of life. Um, rural areas I ended up focusing on rural areas because they really often lack systemic methods to gauge their well-being, and that results in some ad hoc interventions that won't necessarily address underlying issues. Because a lot of the data that we have available, it mostly focuses on cities. So yeah, the work that I do focuses on how an introduction of consistent well-being assessment frameworks could be significant for rural areas, and I'm looking at Canada specifically, so that we can measure and systemically address issues of development in those spaces. So this line of research started a while ago at the beginning of the pandemic. I was not a data researcher in any way before this. I worked mainly on production, local production and local producers. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I started to work with Eric Miller and Peter Victor at York University on the Ecological Footprint Initiative, which York had just sort of procured, is maybe not the right word, but they had created an agreement with the Global Footprint Network to produce the accounts at the university. So they set out to do some research on what was the best way to produce those accounts and what we needed to focus on as researchers. And so they had this grant, and one of the things that they needed to do was the second one, and that was to figure out the demand for the ecological footprint among Canadian stakeholders. So I went out, the ecological footprint is one data is a data tool. So it provides a data point for how big a footprint of a country is, just in case you're not familiar. So I went out and I interviewed some key sustainability stakeholders all across Canada, representation from every region, people who were in charge of NGOs, politicians at different levels of government. And I started interviewing them all until I started to hear the same story over and over and over again. And that was that what we really need is better data, not at the national, better disaggregated data, not national level data, but that community groups need data, that they are wondering how to improve life at the community level, trying to make decisions about where roads should be built and where those materials should come from. And so the these stakeholders were saying that this was the data that was required. It presented a bit of an issue because the footprint data is largely, it's not largely, it is national, but there are some things that we could do with it. But this community level was interesting to me because my background with working with producers is largely in environmental sociology, and so we know that community level change is really effective for long-term change rather than individual or even national level change. We know that communities are an effective scale for motivating people to do things differently as a group. And this is partly because they kind of want to fit in with their community, and partly because they already do fit in with their community. And so they're willing to work together towards common goals that they think will improve their well-being. We also know that when people feel part of a meaningful community, they start to feel better about themselves. And so there's some other things related to ecological economics here that we start to combat by looking at the community level for change, like around higher self-esteem and less depression, less loneliness, these things that sort of plague some of society right now and have resulted in a lot of consumption in order to combat some of those feelings. That's how a lot of people will fulfill those needs in themselves. But by having these strong communities that are working towards common goals, we can combat some of that by providing that meeting. Community levels are also an easy way to have direct impact rather than provincial or national, provincial or state, sorry. So it can be hard to infiltrate, and state and federal policies can be unpredictable. They can be influenced by a lot of different factors. But communities will, they'll be able to work together and they will end up having a cascading effect. So some strong communities could impact cities, which could impact provinces eventually, and so on. And it's just easier to make the change at that level. So to make those communities strong, all they really need to do is work on group goals as a collective. And so we know all that about communities. And so it would seem that communities would be a good scale to focus on, and that by providing collective goals, we could strengthen them and we could lead to real environmental sustainability change, well-being, improved well-being. So talking to the stakeholders and knowing these things about communities led us to two questions about how to use the data. How can we motivate and measure change in communities, sustainable change or well-being, improved well-being, and what kind of changes are effective for sustainability? The first question was less the research I did, more the research that the data analysts did. But seeing data-based improvements and effective visuals can help motivate groups to change and to see that over time, to create benchmarking things. So we worked with a group to create a community footprint calculator, essentially. We designed a form that sums individual footprint totals into a combined footprint that is then translated into a community footprint. So we took the sum of the community and produced one average footprint for the community group. And it could be any size community, really. So then we use that to generate some nice visuals that I'll show you in a minute. So that they could see what their footprint looked like over time. And then based on the inputs of the group, so the group would input their data into the footprint calculator, into this form, produce that group calculator. They would be shown the areas in which they needed to improve over time if they wanted to lower their footprint as a community together. And then we would provide relevant behavior change recommendations or goals that they could work on together. So this would ultimately strengthen their community, which has this while also having this kind of indirect impact on sustainability benefits or well-being benefits, whatever the behavior change suggestion related to. So then the question then was, what kind of behavior change options will inspire communities to work together? So to figure that out, we needed to go through each footprint category. So the footprint is broken down into food, housing, transportation, goods, and services. And then cross-reference those categories with policies and values that already exist in ecological economics. But finding a compiled source of ecological economic policies was actually very difficult. And so instead of doing it on my own, I started a massive shared Google document that I'm happy to share with anyone who wants in. And in it, we came up with ideas as an ecological economic community around different approaches to those categories at the both the individual state or provincial and federal levels. Some people emailed me just their ideas and I added them in. Others edited the document directly. You can see that people were having some discussions in the sides here. And it ended up being quite comprehensive. It's quite long. And the contributors are largely Canadian. Also, several people from Vermont. The Vermont Ecological Economic Group does a lot of work with CANSI, and some from Europe. In total, 48 different ecological economists contributed to this list of policy options. And then we translated it into there's a website on the Economics for the Anthropocene webpage, which was that's a training group that trained several students over 7 years on ecological economics with a relationship between Vermont, McGill, and York University. So this is on that website. And again, I can share the link. Where we put it basically just into a nicer form. It's all the same information that's on that Google Doc, but it just looks nicer. So it included these 11 different areas or topics, and then within each separated down for individual behavior change, municipal governance strategies, and then national or even international policy strategies. And then also each one has some resources for people. So if we've used this several times where if we are having, someone wants to talk to us about finance or about equity or whatever, you can go to it and we include resources that have some videos or just some statistics that you can use to relate those topics to ecological economics. So this became the base of the solutions for this project with the communities, and then for some other work going forward that I'll talk about. It was all really based off of this group collaborative process. So, it's not necessarily a peer-reviewed list, obviously, but it's more of like a open access sort of wiki style approach to generating these policy ideas and approaches to change in an ecological economics fashion. So then we use that set of ideas to generate relevant options for the communities to work through together, which would ultimately lead to new answers in their individual footprint survey. So as they would change things, as they would do things, it would change their input value into this top area here, into their averaged footprint. And then they would be able to see the footprint change over time and see the impacts of the actions that they put together. So we did this with a couple of communities. We met with them. We also did some research to understand their specific cultural needs and then integrated those into behavior change recommendations. So one was a parish, for example. And so some of the behavior change recommendations were related to church or church activities. And then added any other questions that might be relevant to that group if they wanted it. Again, I'll have an example of this a little later. Our pilot was with 28 people. This is just just a snippet of what it produces, what the tool produces. So you can see these are the different components of the footprint. The largest one is cropland. That's very common because people eat a lot of food. Carbon is second here, again, quite common. And then we would run different things and make different statements. Like if everyone lived like the person with the lowest footprint in their community, they could save 250 global hectares per year of footprint. And so this was to say there are areas to learn from each other. Interestingly, this is just kind of interesting piece. This is the Canadian average and this was the community average, and they're pretty much, they're very, very similar. And then we showed the smallest in their community and then the largest in their communities. And then we generated, based on their answers, recommendations. So things like purchasing and eating local foods, appliance upgrades. This list of things were all things that this group could do because they scored low in these areas, essentially. Like community personal care, like budgeting, only one person was doing any kind of budgeting or counseling or therapy around some of the issues we were talking about. So the feedback from this process was really positive. We haven't done the longitudinal study to see if it will change behavior over time. And it didn't actually answer the stakeholder needs for needing specific data on the municipal area for decision making, but it was really a good tool for communities to come together. Like if you had a school or a church group or whatever community club you have, to do work that would improve your environmental footprint and in some ways some of the well-being pieces as well. But it was very disaggregated, very broken down, and we wanted a data set for a slightly larger regional decision making, particularly in areas that have this hard time of getting access to the data. So like I mentioned, rural communities, they do have this unique challenge with restricted access to resources and economic fluctuations that are inconsistent with urban areas. And then with, the influences of climate change and demographic shifts and the COVID-19 pandemic, these all intensify the difficulties in rural areas in getting the kind of attention that they need for tailored interventions at that level. So, for example, here in Cape Breton, where I live, we are going to be seeing probably an enormous amount more of storms, hurricanes as the years go by. But there's no data about like community preparedness and about some of the other pieces of well-being, people coming together, how they come together, and emergency response, these kinds of things. This data doesn't exist for us to know how to combat these problems that we'll be facing. So many of the large data sets we have access to do focus on the urban areas. So here in Cape Breton, it largely focuses, a lot of the data that we have access to focuses on Halifax. So then rural areas struggle to obtain correct and accurate data. And that's going to make them vulnerable by making it difficult to implement solutions to ongoing and these emerging issues. So, in response to the need for the comprehensive assessment, and also in response to the stakeholder call for municipal data data for municipal decision making, we at the Footprint we started to work with the Rural Ontario Institute and started this project that uses data from various sources, not just the Footprint, to create a profile of each community across rural Ontario that highlights different well-being indicators. So to make this dashboard, we started by figuring out what indicators would be included in it. The Footprint, again, is just one of many indicators that was included. The goal wasn't to replicate any efforts because here in Canada, we do have something called the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, which does some of what this does. But what we really were aiming for was to find the most effective indicators for improving well-being and then create a dashboard that was interactive that rural communities can use to generate data for various purposes. So we looked up basically all the data that we could get for rural, this is Ontario, for rural Ontario. And then we brought together 18 what we called data champions to vote on the indicators that would be the most relevant. So this is the economics indicator page, and the colors mean different things about how important each one is. I don't remember exactly at the top of my head. I have it written down somewhere. But yeah, and so they would vote on them, and then this is just like a different view of the outcomes there. So the number one, for example, economics indicator that people wanted to see on this was household income, but also things like access to high-speed internet and unemployment rates were also ones that were important for people just on this one particular indicator. So they voted on them. There are some, you can see a 1 down here, change in medium-sized businesses. Any indicator, oh, that didn't show up. I'm sorry. Well, there's a picture there. And it shows it's a table that any of the indicators that had fewer than 3 we discussed as a group, and this was a list of the ones that had fewer than 3, and I'll just read out. For example, maximum 1 day of precipitation or forest pests were very low. They were not voted on very low or voted on very much. So we discussed them and then decided whether or not to exclude them or include them. Other categories included that we had previous relationships with. We did a pilot test with those 3 communities where we created this dashboard with all of their data on it, and then asked them to interact with it and engage with it, and asked the local politicians and people how they would use it, etc. Had the data champions engage with it. The steering committee also engaged with it to get feedback on the site's usability, the aesthetics, if it was helpful, what would be more helpful, what was missing. We held community meetings with 4 different community meetings with folks to see their feedback on it and if they thought this was useful, and collected, some surveys and some feedback on that. So overall, on assessing well-being, all of the participants really agreed that the indicators that were featured on the pilot dashboard were relevant measures, but that different additional indicators would be needed to understand the bigger picture. They agreed that economic, society, and housing were relevant, but only 25% were really interested in institutional indicators. So there wasn't a lot of interest there. Most of them agreed that applying local knowledge and context to the data output would make it easier to tell stories about their community's well-being. And so they thought that this would help, not just when they were talking to politicians, they were trying to make arguments that they now had data to back up some of the stories that they were telling, to try and make the change that they wanted to make. They all agreed that the dashboard revealed interesting and new information about their community, and in some cases, it just confirmed assumptions that they had previously had, and that they liked that it helped them to compare their community to other communities. And they somewhat agreed that the information could help with community level decision making. So at the smaller level that I was talking about before, where we had the community footprint thing, that it might be able to make change at that level. But there was a really strong agreement among all participants that it could help inform regional decision making, which is significant because that's an actual like municipal regional decision making has actual like boards and politicians that make those decisions. So you could bring them to them. So they could see that happening. They also agreed it could be useful for use planning, setting goals and targets for development, briefing leadership, engaging the public, and tracking performance over time in the different areas that are present. We also got feedback on the look and accessibility of it. Then we redid it again to make the current dashboard that will go live. Well, it sort of went soft live. So this is what it looks like now. And it can really break down into pretty specific regions. So this is the Waterloo region. It's where I'm from sort of originally. And the indicator that I have open here is biocapacity balance per capita. So that's an element of the footprint. So it's how much available environment essentially there is per person. And so you can see the numbers, and it's broken down quite comprehensively there for people to see what's available in the region. So the dashboard's now being used in several different areas and regions, and we will follow up. The results of the feedback on this iteration were emailed to me last night. I took a really quick peek. They were, again, generally positive, but I didn't have time to sort through it before the presentation. So there's more results on the effectiveness of this, but I didn't read them yet. So our next step is that we're going to take the calculator and apply it to other rural areas. And since I'm in Cape Breton and Cape Breton is rural, we've turned our focus here. So Cape Breton it's an island on the east of Halifax. There are major data gaps here. I've met with a researcher here who had just finished doing a project on how to improve well-being indicators and sustainability indicators for transition on the island. And the major outcome of her study was that there's this need for more comprehensive data in the region. And so there's a call for this kind of thing here. So we just got the funding. We'll start the work soon. One of the things we're going to do here that's a little different from the Ontario dashboard is that we're going to bring two projects kind of together. So we'll have this regional dashboard, but the community here is very interested in a sort of community level behavior change tool. Um, I'll explain. So we're going to have both. So the way that we're going to have both is we'll do the dashboard, like I showed you, and then we're going to replicate another project that we did for a rural Indigenous community in Ontario, the Métis Nation, so that then the Mi'kmaq Nation here would also have specific data about their community footprint alongside the other larger data sets available to them. So I'll just briefly talk about what we did with the Métis Nation, just so you have an idea of what we will do with the Mi'kmaq Nation here. So the Métis calculator it was focused on the Métis Nations of Ontario. It's this really fun, interactive, informative tool. It can let you calculate the impact of lifestyle based on the environment and the community. This is based back down onto the ecological footprint. This is the first of its kind. So there is the individual footprint calculator that you've maybe done before. I think if you just Google footprint calculator, you'll get it. It's very, very popular. It gets millions of views a year, I think. And it's lots of people. I mean, I did it in high school, so it's been around for a while. And so it's kind of like that, but integrating the Métis knowledge and way of life into the questions and the calculations. So it was really a first. And the idea was to highlight actions for Métis Nation citizens to identify what they could do to improve their community and the planet. So each of the pages, which I'll show you. Actually, I don't think I will. But when you get to the end, the pages have videos that we made featuring Métis Nation of Ontario knowledge holders that would share key insights and tips for living a more sustainable way in those different areas that I mentioned that the footprint does. So the food, transportation, etc. We interviewed elders oh my goodness, why isn't it showing up? This is just a map of the Métis Nation. Hopefully these ones. Oh, well, you know what I'm going to do because it's not working. I'm just gonna, so you can see. Um, so this is because I want you to see this. So, oh, it just doesn't work when it's a full screen. So these are the different Métis nations. And so we interviewed different elders from each of the region's councils that are starred on those maps. And then we looked at the different indicators that were deemed important by those groups. So, for example, things like hunting and fishing were deemed as important, but those are not typically included in the footprint. So then we went through and we asked them what region that they lived in, so that it would isolate the areas because it would change based on where people lived. And then ask them specific questions like what percentage of your household food is obtained through hunting, fishing, gathering, and harvesting, so that people could, so that would impact the community footprint as well. And another one that was specific to them was ATVs and how much they traveled on ATVs or motorboats. This is not something that's usually in a footprint calculator. And then the other was, do you prioritize purchasing from Métis producers? And oh, that one's showing up. I don't know why. And then again, the footprint would change based on that answer. So the solutions the recommendations were tailored to the specific community. So, for example, the Thunder Bay Good Food Box nonprofit volunteers. So this recommendation would show up at the end of the footprint calculator if they had chosen that they lived in the Thunder Bay region. And so these things will populate depending on what they put in. And then the other piece of the recommendations that would be included is Métis specific things. So this was the honor the Métis teachings regarding the importance of water by reducing water consumption, etc. You can read it. And so some of the recommendations would focus specifically on the Métis teachings that we had learned from the elders who we interviewed in those different areas, in different regions, in the Métis Nation. So, and this is, and then these are the videos. They're actually quite nice. So you can go, I can share the link to the Métis calculator as well. And you can go and you can watch the videos that they have. You can look at the calculator. It's a very well done. We partnered with a Métis web development company, and they did all of the web developing for the calculator, and it's really slick. Um, yeah, and so what we're going to do, we're going to follow this same process here in Cape Breton. So there's not, for example, as much hunting here. It's just not something that the Mi'kmaq do as much as the Métis would in Ontario, just because of different fauna. But fishing here is quite significant. Also, the Indigenous community here is quite economically uh, powerful in a lot of ways. They just purchased, for example, Clearwater, which is one of the biggest fishing companies in Canada, at least. I want to say the world, but I'm not. I wouldn't be 100% sure on that. I think they own over 50% of the shares now. So they have different interests here. And so we're going to talk to the Mi'kmaq community about what kinds of things they would want to see on this data dashboard, because they were one of the ones that the researcher here spoke to, who said we need data so that we know what kinds of things to put our money and our energy and our time into. Should we be putting that into procuring things like the fishing company, or should we be doing that? Should we be putting our finances, et cetera, into things like renewable energy? So trying to figure out the best places. They need the help to figure out the best places for those investments to go into. So the data is really just starting to roll in on the effectiveness of the tool. But it's promising, and we want to expand it and see if it can be used in different areas of Canada and internationally. And so those are the next stages, the next steps. So thank you again for inviting me to talk with all of you and engage here. Kansi and UC have a long history, and it's always nice to have some crossover between the groups. So thank you.
No, thank you. That was very interesting and it's a great project. So thank you for presenting it. And don't worry about your technical difficulties. I had some myself in the middle of it. I somehow got kicked off Zoom. So I was glad not everybody got kicked off except me. So that was good. We're going to open it up for some questions. People can either raise their hand or put it in the chat. And we'll open the floor to questions now or comments. There was one question I got actually in a text message from someone online, and I'll ask it. Um, with the project that you were doing, did you receive a grant to do this? Because it seems like a quite um, grand project in the sense of how much work it is. Did you get a grant? How did you go about funding the project?
Yeah, so the first stage of it that I was hired on at York to do, that was a grant, its own separate grant. It was a knowledge mobilization grant through SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is probably our largest granting agency here in Canada. That's where a lot of social scientists, researchers are going to get their financing from, either from SSHRC, and then there's another one that's NSERC, which is natural resources. It's like the science one. And then there's a health one. So that was a SSHRC grant to do the interviewing of the stakeholders. The next step of the community footprint calculator was funded by a I don't know if you would call it private group, but by a community essentially. And also some funding from CUSP, which I never remember what CUSP stands for. Uh, but it's where Tim Jackson works in Center for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. Sorry, I never understand what the. So we So that was funded through a CUSP project. And then so that was the community footprinting. And then the Rural Ontario Institute funding was through partially from York University's funding of the Ecological Footprint Initiative. So we paid for half of a student researcher. And then the Rural Ontario Institute, I applied with them to get a MyTax internship. So MyTax is another big Canadian granting industry agency that will do internships for students to engage with research and projects. So we had that was funded through that. And then the most recent iteration is funded again by a new SSHRC. So there's a new SSHRC grant. So yes, there was funding, lots of it from different places. And it the project sparked a lot of interest from a lot of different people because there's always this interest of not only community well-being but rural well-being as well. So we would work with whoever was there with the funding and make it work. But now like we have a more centralized one. Also, we got a large SSHRC grant right before I left York to here to Cape Breton, a large one to do more training of students on the footprint, and it includes a lot on these kinds of research projects to get them engaged with them as well. And I was just going to throw in the chat real quick the link to that. I saw someone say UC would love to have access to the document. That's the document. It's not again, it's nothing fancy. It really is just a big list of stuff that people wrote in. But I think it was really worth it. And we started it towards it was early in the pandemic that we started to do it. And I think that it was really important for all of us at that time as we were thinking about the kinds of changes we needed to make. I think it was sort of empowering to see it all come together and to hear from everyone else how we could make those changes and engage with each other. So yeah, that's that. You're welcome to peruse it, add to it, whatever you'd like.
And there's another question in the chat. Could you tell us more about the economics for the Anthropocene?
Yeah, so the economics for the Anthropocene was it was another SSHRC SSHRC project. So SSHRC does these big 7-year training projects where they will fund the training of graduate students in particular areas of interest. So this one was a partnership between the University of Vermont, McGill University in Quebec, and York University in Toronto. And the idea was to train, I don't know how many it was supposed to be, 5 to 7 PhD students per year for 7 years on ecological economics specifically. So they did that, and it was a really good training project. I did my postdoc with E4A in at McGill, and it morphed towards the end into leadership for the Ecozoic, which is a training program that is still ongoing. And it is just a partnership now between University of Vermont and McGill University. And it switched its name because largely due, again, sort of funding interests. And it was just sort of changing what it would, broadening from ecological economics into more leadership for transition into a new world, I guess you could say. And so that still exists. They still take students every year, PhD students. I'm not sure if they do master's students. I think they do. But the CANSI, we just held our biennial student symposium in Montreal last week or the week before. So we bring together 20 emerging scholars in the field and we partner them with leading scholars in the field. So people, that we all are familiar with. And we ask them to read the students' work and then they get feedback on that. And then that helps them improve their work. And a lot of the students that were there, so we had 20, and I think 7 of them were from the leadership for the Ecozoic program. So a lot of them still do the ecological economics work. So it's E4A, Economics of the Anthropocene, lives on as leadership for the Ecozoic and continues to train students. And it's created a really incredible group of emerging ecological economists, really.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Just have a quick question too. Thank you, Katie. I'm Francis. I'm one of the relatively newer leadership of the Ecozoic Fellows at the University of Vermont. I was wondering if you can just comment on what was kind of the primary barrier to renewable adoption within the different communities or different factors that went into kind of prohibiting communities from renewable adoptions.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you mean renewable energy
Yes.
adoption. That's it. I can only speak just from engaging with them. So I do any work on renewable energy. But in Ontario, a lot of our electricity is hydro. A great deal of our electricity is hydro. And we also have a lot of wind. So Ontario actually does a pretty good job of renewable energy. It's not perfect. So there's not as much of push from communities to focus on that. I think because hydro is so um readily available, it I don't know the percentage, but it's pretty high what hydro contributes to Ontario. I was spoiled with that living in Ontario. So I lived in Ontario for most of my life, my entire life, except for the last year and the year I was in Quebec. Other than that, I was in Ontario and I was very, very spoiled with hydroelectric when I moved out here. And all of a sudden, everyone had oil tanks in the back of their house. That was really new for me. I've since learned that that's a more normal experience and engagement with energy across North America than I knew because again, Ontario just spoiled us so much. So here, now I'm starting to see barriers to the adoption of renewable energy quite a lot. For a community like Cape Breton, for example, and this will be the same in several. I know this is similar in Haida Gwaii, which is another island on the other side of Canada in British Columbia. Infrastructure to transition is expensive, and there's not a lot of money that gets filtered to these areas. So a lot of the money that goes to the province here goes to Halifax, not to Cape Breton. So there's not a lot of financing options. Private groups are there's not a lot of education around. So the woman I was speaking about who did the research with the groups that said they needed more data to make decisions. She also, one of her second major finding, was that there's barriers to energy transition and transportation transition because of a lack of education about what that would look like in the day-to-day life of citizens who live here. So because of sort of the rhetoric around the politicization of these things around renewables and around, transit, people for whatever reason would see it as limiting their access to energy, or they're limiting their freedom, or limiting their financial independence, that it would cost them more money to make these transitions. And they don't see climate change as a significant threat at this time, even though they're all aware that this is going to be the worst year for hurricanes that they've ever had. There's no link there, because there's just not a lot of people just don't know. And that's the thing in rural areas, is that they're different from urban ones, where urban ones there's always a lot of this that you get, usually there's universities there's a lot of educational initiatives going on about informing people about the sustainability, these kinds of things. That doesn't really exist in rural spaces as often, and it's more difficult to reach people here. So limited knowledge, limited finances. Those are probably the two biggest ones. Oh, and then the other one I just spoke to someone about, because we live on the ocean. I was like, why don't we have more offshore wind and like wave energy generation? Our number one financial producing market here is tourism, and they were worried that that would reduce the view of the ocean if we put anything in it. So that was another major barrier here about energy adoption, renewable energy adoption, sorry. Which is probably not a different answer than you get when you ask about a lot of places. So,
Right. It's more of a comment. thanking you for your presentation. And as far as the presentation and paper goes, is there a place that we could find paper, or is it still in production?
Yeah, so as you can tell, I got the results last night. It is written. We'll write that last paragraph in. So the one about the stakeholders has is just going on is undergoing revision for getting published in the journal EE. So I'll be submitting the revised version in a week or two, and so hopefully that'll get through soon. And then the one specific on the rural on the work with the Rural Ontario Institute. Um, we just finished writing it. It was a little bit of a slower process because working with community groups, we wanted to have everybody sort of give their input on it. And so I had to add in the new output that I got, the new results I got last night, and then we'll be putting it into somewhere to get published. So soon. It's all just very new, so it's not quite out there yet.
All right. Is there any other comments or questions? Jeremy, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. The policy recommendations that would come from the data that you gather in a rural area, maybe I just don't know and it's obvious. But how would that be unique or different from the data that is already gathered in an urban area?
Well, so for example, here on island, we have two or three hospitals servicing people that live very, very far away from them. So the data story that is presented about Nova Scotia as a province is that there is very readily accessible access to healthcare, because in Halifax, where most people live, there is readily available access to healthcare. There are lots of long-term care facilities. There's lots of available housing. In Cape Breton, we have a major problem with people accessing hospitals. We have very, very few to no more long-term care facility spaces left. We are in the middle of a housing crisis. Yeah, so those are three examples. But that's not the provincial data story, because the data story focuses on the city, not on the rural space.
Okay. Is there anything else? Right, I'm not seeing anything. So with that, I want to thank you, Kate. Oops. Oh, no, it's a thank you. I want to thank you, Kate, for doing this presentation and sharing your research with us. It was extremely interesting. I know I've gotten several text messages saying how great it was. So thank you very much, and we really can't thank you enough for this. And then just to remind everybody, July 26th, our next seminar at noon. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Kat. Yeah. Good night here in Indonesia. Bye bye.
Bye.